Stroschine has agreed to do this great presentation for us. I've seen it once before, it's marvelous, and I'll just let them take off. So.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Well, as Mark said, I'm Lee Stroschine. I am on the board of directors for the Fort Meade Museum. I am also the research librarian and archivist here at the Sturgis Public Library. And I've had an interest in military history of the Old West period, of the time period of Little Bighorn, 7th Cavalry, Fort Meade, since I was a little kid. So, and everything that you see up here, with the exception of 2 items, belong to me. And all of them but one are reproductions. And the one item I borrowed from the Fort Meade Museum. So I want to thank them for letting me borrow it. I also have one other thank you I want to do, and it's a thank you to Paul Horsted, because he allowed me to use a photograph from his recently updated edition of Exploring with Custer, his book that he did about the Custer expedition through the Black Hills. I'm using one of his pictures with his permission. So, and I've got Sean Henderson. He's also on the board of directors at Fort Meade. He's being my model, so that I can have him put things on and point things out. That way I don't have to try to put things on me and point them out. So, with that, I'll get started on things. Some of my presentation is slideshow, some of it's pointing things out. As you can see, that's a picture of me taken a few years ago out at Fort Meade, dressed up when we had cavalry days a few years ago. It is a reproduction tintype that Mark's brother Dave did for me out there. And I thought, what a perfect picture to use as a background. Now, just a little background history of uniforms. The American Civil War ended in 1865. There were several 100,000 soldiers in the Army at the end of the Civil War. Well, after the war was over, the U.S. military decided they didn't need several 100,000 soldiers. So they reduced the size of the Army to about 30,000 men. Well, you've got all the equipment for several 100,000 to outfit 30,000 men. So there were equipment, uniforms and other equipment that soldiers were wearing from the Civil War up and through the 1880s, and even later. There were National Guard units that went to Cuba during the Spanish-American War in 1898 that were still using Civil War items. So, but the Army, in their infinite wisdom, decided to make changes. The first big changes that occurred were in 1872. Then there were changes in 1874, 1876, 1880, 1884, 1892. I'm not going to cover all those changes because some of the changes were very minor. Like the trousers I'm wearing, okay? They're actually Civil War era trousers, but they made changes in 1872. The little strap here that I've got that's leather, okay? They put in a cloth strap. 1874, they changed the pockets. Just minor changes like that. Some of them were major changes, some of those I'll point out. Now, when we think of the Old West and soldiers being dressed, this is what we think of, the Hollywood image. Well, looking at this picture, about the only thing that is accurate are the belts. Everything else in there is either worn incorrectly or was never worn at all. Okay? The belt, the guy that's got on the left with the belt loops on his pants, they didn't have those. The yellow scarf, no, they never wore yellow scarves. So, with that, get my notes here so I know where I'm going. Okay, Sean, come around over here. We're going to start with you first. The first thing I'm going to point out is the hat that he's wearing. Okay, this is a model 1872 cap. It's what they wore, and it was issued to all the soldiers. They would have one of those, and that stayed in use until the 1880s. So if you would have been out at Fort Meade in 1878, you would have seen soldiers wearing that. This wouldn't have been a war for dress parade. It would have been everyday or fatigue use. Now, if they were out on campaign, as in the Custer expedition here, they would have wore something that provided a little more shelter, cover to their face, and this would have been a private purchase item. You would have had to go to the sutler and buy this. This wouldn't have been issued. The Army had wonderful ones that they did issue in 1872. Oh, okay. Here's a picture showing the officers of the 8th Cavalry in 1892 with their caps. Okay? They have the insignia. I don't have any insignia on mine here, but you can see the insignia on their caps and their officer uniforms that they're wearing. Here's the picture from Paul Horsted from the Custer expedition, and the hat that I'm referring to, the lovely one that the military did, you can see on the gentleman on the far right. It's folded up. It was one that they came up with so that you could fold up one side or both sides or have it hang down in the middle, but you could fold it up so it would fit in a small area. But you can see the variety of hats. These are all officers, but the enlisted men would have been dressed similarly as far as their hats, with just whatever they wanted to wear. Some of the officers, and I don't have, the third one from the right that's wearing his kind of pirate style, that's Captain Benteen. And he's actually one of them, from what I've read, that it liked this hat. Most of the soldiers hated it because it was so floppy that when they put it down, it just kind of drooped, and in rainy weather like we had just a few minutes ago, it didn't protect them from the weather too much. But you can see a variety of hats that they wore. So continuing on down to what the soldiers were wearing, we got Sean here. Step over here, Sean. Okay. What he's got on is called an 1872 pattern blouse. Now, at the time, well, before the Civil War, they had colors to designate cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Okay? Cavalry was yellow, artillery was red, and infantry was blue. So the blue piping on here means this is an infantry coat. It's a lovely coat with pleats here on the front, all these buttons that you have to button up and polish for inspection purposes. The soldiers hated it because the pleats got caught in things, all the buttons were there, and so they got rid of it. And so you get to take that off, Sean. Before that, at the time of the Civil War, they just had a 5-button coat that they would wear. And actually, I won't have Sean put this one up, but this is what they would have worn at the Civil War and even later on. You can see there's no blue piping on it. Cavalry would have had yellow and would have had a different style coat.
This one?
That one on it, yep. Okay. You'll notice as he's putting this one on, it's got yellow. It's a cavalry coat. And it doesn't have the pleats. It's got fewer buttons. And this is what the soldiers would have been wearing at the Custer expedition when they came through here in 1874. Custer must have had some connection and some strings to pull because he got the 7th Cavalry outfitted with all the new stuff. 1873, the Army came out with a new carbine for the cavalry. That's what the Custer expedition troops had with them when they came. But you can see, it looks like it's a much more relaxed coat. And these coats would have been what they wore on field duty, fatigue duty, not dress parade. They had a special dress uniform for that. You can take that off, Sean. Okay, and here's the next coat. This is the 1883 pattern coat. Goes back to more like the Civil War era coat, without the colorful piping on it, because, well, if you got a soldier that's in the cavalry and he suddenly changes and joins the infantry or vice versa, you got to issue him all new clothing. 1883, they got rid of that on their fatigue uniform, trying to save some money. Okay. Hold that up. Okay. And then the shirt. Okay, this is what the soldiers would have wore underneath the blouse that was there. And you were not seen outside of your barracks just in that, unless you were doing actual fatigue duty, like digging ditches, or if you were in the cavalry, scooping manure. Then you'd be in that. But otherwise, you had your coat on.
What's the material?
What's the material? Yeah, it's a wool. Yeah.
Very woolly.
Yeah.
Very woolly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the thing with the blouses, the coats that the soldiers wore, they said in the wintertime they were too cold, and in the summertime they were too hot. But that's all that they had. That was what the military was. But yeah, oh, it gets better than that. In here in just a minute. Okay. And then, step out of the way, Sean, a little bit. That down. They made some changes, and this is, the shirt that I'm wearing is representative of this. This isn't quite correct because this is a nice lightweight cotton. It should be a heavier cotton flannel type material. But 1883, they made the change so that they could wear a shirt, because they had leftover material that was from the Civil War that was too lightweight for the blouse. And so they did that. This is some of the 8th Cavalry out at Fort Meade. And you can see the blue coat that the sergeant right there, or the blue shirt the sergeant sitting right there in front is wearing. And those of you that are in the military might be going, how does he know that's a sergeant? Because there's no stripes on his sleeve. That's because he took his coat off. But he's got a stripe on his pants. And sergeants would have a stripe on their pants as well as officers, but the officers are standing in the back supervising. So, now, I mentioned my infantry trousers that I'm wearing. Sean his is a little bit different. Come on over here, Sean. Turn around so they can see your back. Okay? You see the difference between mine and his? I've got infantry, he's got cavalry. And his are a field change to his trousers. The military did have cavalry trousers that had an extra layer of this wool fabric on them to cover the seat and the legs. Well, the wool didn't last as long. So what they would do, the soldiers would do, is they would get canvas and line them with that, or have the tailor or a laundress do that for them so that it would survive better on horseback than the wool. I keep going over here. This is where my notes are. No, that's okay. Now we go to what they wore on their feet. No, actually, you get you hold those. And I'll hold these, being as you've got the cavalry stuff and I've got the infantry. The cavalry soldiers would have high boots like that. Okay? They would be a 16-inch high boot that they would wear. They would tuck their pants into it so that it would protect their feet and their legs as they're on horseback going through whatever they might go through. Infantry soldiers would have a pair of shoes like this. Cavalry soldiers would also have a pair of shoes like this as well for doing things around the fort, fatigue duty or just in general. Those were saved for field duty, going on campaign, parades. These were what they wore. Okay? Nice leather soles, a metal plate here to keep the heel from wearing down, which walking on earth surfaces, grass and dirt is not bad. Walking on modern surfaces like concrete and asphalt, those metal heel plates are very slippery. So, an infantry soldier would have a pair of these, a cavalry soldier would have a pair of both. So, we've gone from head to toe so far on what they wore. Now we'll go to what they wore underneath. Okay. They didn't wear tighty-whities or boxers. That's what they wore for underwear underneath their pants. Drawers like that. A cotton, heavy cotton. Yeah. And you wore those, well, in the summertime if it was hot and you wanted to go without, you could. But you're wearing wool, remember. In the wintertime, you definitely wore those because you needed the warmth. Underneath their shirt, and when I mentioned that one was warm, I said it got better. Underneath their shirt, they would have, you can just set that down, Sean. They would have two options of an undershirt that they would wear. That one it's a lighter weight cotton flannel, okay, but it's got shorter sleeves, but you would wear it underneath your shirt. And later on, they went to a knit pattern shirt that they would wear underneath. This one's a little heavier weight than that, so you might stay a little warmer in the wintertime than you would in the summertime. Okay. And of course, you have to hold your pants up somehow or another. I've cheated. The suspenders that I have on actually have some elastic in them, so they're more comfortable. They didn't have elastic. So if your suspenders were too tight and you went to bend over too quickly or too far, you'd lose a button. And then you'd have to deal with that. But this is what they would do. Yeah, go ahead and put it on. That was what's known as a greatcoat.
Weighs 15 pounds.
It was the overcoat that they would wear. They had them in the Civil War. You don't need to button it up, Sean, if you don't want to.
It's showing inside of the
Yeah.
this little cape thing.
Yep.
It's a lot of buttons.
Yeah.
Give me about
My
10
goodness.
minutes. Give me about 10 minutes, I'll be done buttoning.
You got the inside buttons and the outside buttons. In the Civil War, the greatcoat that they had two different greatcoats. They had one for the cavalry and one for the infantry. The difference was, in the infantry one, the cape here was shorter and the cavalry was longer. They decided, when they made the changes in 1874, to give everybody the same length. Which was nice because if you were cold, you could flip that up over and cover your head. Whereas the infantry one really couldn't get up there. And then they made changes in the 1884 regulations. They made changes, and the inside of this was lined with the color. So if you were infantry, it had a light blue lining. If you were cavalry, it had the bright yellow lining. If you were artillery, it had the red lining. So that's what you were issued for your winter coat. Whether you were stationed in Arizona or Fort Meade, South Dakota, that's what you were issued for your winter coat. However, they came to realize that up here on the northern plains, they needed something a little bit warmer to wear. Well, here's a picture of soldiers in the wintertime wearing their greatcoats with muskrat hats that they had that had flaps that would cover their ears. But here's what they would issue. They discovered they needed something a little bit warmer. They gave them buffalo coats. And if you've ever been out to the Fort Meade Museum, we have one of these buffalo coats on display out there. Much better for a Northern Plains winter wearing one of those than one of those. Okay, now we go on to dress uniforms. You can take that one off. Okay? I'm sure you all recognize the gentleman in this picture. Even though he was never in Sturgis, his father was. This is Lieutenant James Sturgis, the son of Colonel Sturgis. Jack was killed at Little Bighorn with Custer. He was a young lieutenant when that happened. Yeah, there's one of that. But actually, this one's an older model than what they found out there. Because this picture is prior to 1876, and the model that was out there was 1881. What we're talking about is the Soap Suds Row dig. They found some buttons that go on the side of that helmet out in Soap Suds Row, but it's from a later model of the helmet. It's the 1881 helmet.
And a vent.
Yeah.
This a couple weeks ago? Like
Yeah.
this last one?
This last one, yeah.
Yeah, and a vent, so your helmet was vented.
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah, it's hard to see, and this one really, it's right on the, fits on the very top where you can see the plume coming out. There's a spike there, and the vent is right underneath that. Okay, here's and now you can actually see where the vent is in this photograph. I didn't see what they found, but from descriptions, what it was is this thing right here that they found underneath the spike, and the little button that they found is right here on the side.
Okay, it was round, and
Okay.
I believe there was.
Oh, okay, a little
on the
vents,
side.
okay.
Yeah,
So they would have been up in here. Okay, I misunderstood. I didn't get to see what it was.
the new BLM guy pulled it up on his phone, what it looked like.
Okay.
But yeah,
So, now, the last picture I have was Jack Sturgis as an officer. This is an enlisted infantryman in his dress uniform. And you're probably wondering, how do I know he's infantry? Because it's in black and white. Okay? He's got a bayonet here. Infantry carried bayonets, cavalry had sabers. So, if it would be a colored picture, the facings here on the sleeve and up there would be blue. They'd be a light blue for infantry. If it was cavalry, it would have been yellow. Artillery, red. And let's see, a number of soldiers on dress parade out at Fort Meade. And you can see them all there with their dress uniforms, their dress helmets, their trousers. The trousers that they wore for their dress uniform and every day were the same trousers. They didn't have specific dress uniform trousers. And then this one here is what I borrowed from Fort Meade. It's a little bit later of a uniform than what we're talking. It's about 1890. Okay, that's an actual uniform that belonged to the hospital steward out at Fort Meade. And that's why it's green. I didn't mention green before, but after the Civil War, they used green for hospital stewards.
what about the Red Cross?
Well, a hospital steward was medical.
Yeah,
And so they- yeah.
right, but yeah.
Yeah, indicated. And a hospital steward was at Fort Meade, for example. The hospital steward would have been in charge of the hospital. He would have been the hospital administrator for things. He would have been the second ranking NCO on the post. The only NCO that would have outranked him would have been the sergeant major, which was the highest ranking at the hospital. So he oversaw, was in charge of everything. Of course, the doctors were above him. They were all officers. But they looked to the hospital steward to do it. And one of the other responsibilities of the hospital steward, he was the pharmacist. So the doctor would say, okay, I need this medication, and the hospital steward would be the one to do it. Now, if they were on campaign in the field, the hospital steward may be the only medical person on that campaign. If there was no doctor available, something happened to the doctor, then the hospital steward
What's that
was a...
one significant,
insignia there.
That's just another insignia of him being a hospital steward. Okay. So. Now, I mentioned the fatigue duty that they did. Cavalry soldiers, because they were dealing with a lot of horse manure and messy things, okay, these are going to get dirty really quick in that case. So they ended up with what were known as stable frocks. It was white trousers and a white coat that were specifically for them to use as they were working in the stables, as they were cleaning the manure, putting in hay, whatever they had to. Yes, Mark?
Were those assigned individually, or were there
Yes.
some pairs in the stable that they just brought?
That's a good question. I don't know whether they were or not. Because the cavalry soldiers, their first responsibility was their horse. It wasn't them. They got up in the morning, the first thing that they did was went and took care of their horse, even before they had breakfast. Their horse came first.
I wonder who decided white was the color.
A man.
A man. Not the woman that had to wash it.
Other people doing the installs, that's
Yeah,
Not the one.
yeah. So, I've never actually seen one of these in person, just in photographs, so I don't know. They're cotton of some sort, but what weight of cotton or anything, I don't know.
They look shiny.
Yeah. Well, the painting on the one side just shows the whole outfit that he would have wore. Okay, now we move on to what they would have carried. And I jumped ahead a little bit, but at the time of the Civil War, because the rifles that they used were muzzle loaders. It had to have it was a paper cartridge you tore open, dumped the powder in, and it had the bullet in there, and you rammed that down. So you had a cartridge box that you carried 40 rounds in for that. Well, when they changed it after the war, they changed the weapons and it went to a cartridge weapon. Well, to begin with, they used those original cartridge boxes, but then they discovered, well, we need to make some changes. So the first one that they did looked like this. Got some straps here to go on your belt. And you hold your 20 rounds of cartridges in here. Well, for some reason, they didn't like this. It didn't last very long. So they changed it. Come here, Sean. And so they went to this one here. Okay, different style. You got rounds here and rounds there. So they would do that. However, go ahead and put that on, Sean, if it fits around you.
I can tell it's probably not gonna fit, but we'll give it a shot. Any guesses how far it'll go? Yeah, it's like,
People were much smaller.
Well,
Shorter, they
this is designed for me.
Oh, okay.
got it.
There you go.
Okay. So you got the cartridge box here. Okay. Now, if I'm an infantry soldier, and this is a cavalry belt is the way I got it set up, but if I'm firing and I'm kneeling down and I got to mess with trying to reach in here and do things, okay, or on horseback trying to deal with this as I'm galloping along, reaching in here, it would cause some problems. So what the soldiers started doing is they made some changes. In the field, they decided to add loops to their belt. A whole lot easier to reach around and grab those than out of a cartridge box. The military liked this. One of the odd things, something the soldiers did in the field that the higher ranking officers went, hey, that's a good idea. So they gave them this to use.
Yeah, Lee, it also led to the deaths of many of the soldiers because they had copper
Mm-hmm.
rounds. The copper
Yep.
would interact with leather,
Yep.
causing gummy
Yep.
surface, and when
Yep.
they put it in their guns, it would jam the gun.
Yep. Yep, that was an issue they had with the leather. And so they did change and go to a canvas belt.
Interesting.
So, step that way a little bit, please, Sean, so they can see. Here we have an infantry soldier on the march. All the equipment that he would carry. On his, he's carrying his Springfield rifle, trapdoor Springfield. Which I happen to bring one of mine. This is an original, by the way, from 1873, if I got the right one. If not, it's older. Yep. This is my 1873. Infantry would carry this. Okay, you can see him with it over his shoulder, carrying that. And then all his other equipment, he's got his blanket roll, he's got his blanket, his greatcoat that are all wrapped together in there. What you don't see wrapped in there, okay, the blanket's here. Okay, he had what was called a rubberized blanket that would be used
Nice.
to keep the rain off of him as need be. Not a poncho, just a rubber blanket. And he also would have a shelter half, which meant if he didn't have a partner, he didn't have a tent. Because there's a row of buttons on this, your partner would have another half, you would button them together. Each one of you would have a pole that came apart in two pieces. So if you didn't have a partner, you had half of a shelter and one pole to try to set up for your camp. If there were two of you, great. So if you were the odd man out, you hope to find two guys that were willing to share their tent with you, so you could do that. But that's what he would carry in there. Then on his left side, the white thing is his haversack, and that's what he would carry his food in. And one of the wonderful things that the Army did was they decided to give the soldiers in 1872 a way to carry their meat ration. A lovely thing called a meat tin. Okay. Just like that. Carry your meat in. Your salt pork, your fresh beef if you were lucky enough. Okay, you got that. Well, then you're supposed to try to cook it in this. Guess what? Soldiers hated these. But that's what they were issued. And the haversack had a nice little pouch built in, designed for the meat can just to fit nice and neat in here.
They get a daily ration, right?
Yeah, well, it would
Fresh
depend.
meat every day?
It would depend on what they were doing and where they were going. As I'll show you here in a little bit, they were issued sometimes multiple days ration to carry with them. And then the thing on the right side, okay, is where he would carry his personal items, his extra clothing, whatever would be in there. And those were all connected. He had his belt on that had leather suspenders, that all those things connected to those leather suspenders around his belt. The Army used it for a few years and decided, that's not a very good system. So they got rid of the leather suspenders.
What would be the weight of what he's carrying?
I'll get to that in a minute. So, okay. Now we've got here, oh, yeah, okay. This is a picture of the 25th Infantry that was stationed out at Fort Meade. The 25th Infantry was African Americans, all except the officers. So any whites that you see in this photograph are officers. Everybody else, all the enlisted men, were African Americans. They were infantry, so they were carrying their musket and a bayonet. Okay, I have actually two different bayonets. The scabbards are a little bit different, and that's what I'm going to point out. This is the earlier one. It would go over your belt, just like this, with this leather frog. Well, when you have a belt like this with canvas on it, the leather doesn't slide too well on it. So when they issued the new belts that were canvas, they changed the bayonet scabbard to have this little hook. And so you could take that little hook and it would fit right down inside there. Doesn't work quite as well on the leather belt as it does the canvas one, but so. And the bayonet, just to show you, well, I'm not going to jam it on there because it's not designed for this one, but it would go on there, and that's what the infantry soldier would carry. Okay. Fighting out on the frontier, you really didn't use bayonets too often, but it was a holdover from the earlier years. And you can see that, well, you can't see with these soldiers of the 25th Infantry, but you can see their belts. They've got the canvas belts with the loops on them, but you can see the changes with the backpack as well with those. Okay, and Sean's got the saber belt. Okay, it had the cartridge pouch on it that I pointed out, and then the saber, of course, that the cavalry soldier would have, this holster with the pistol in it, and then this little thing right here. This was another thing that the soldiers in the field came up with. It was a place they would carry the cartridges for the revolver, and it would be very handy for them to reach. Otherwise, they'd have a cartridge box to do. Not something that was issued, but something that was made for the soldiers that they would acquire, or the sutler would have for them to use. Now, cavalry soldier, okay, doesn't get to carry and march with his rifle with him. He's got a strap, because his carbine has a little ring here, so that he could carry it on his side. There would be a little leather loop of some sort on his saddle that the barrel would go in. And so as he was riding, it would keep it from flopping out like that, but it would be on his side attached to the strap, like in the first picture that I had of myself there. And the trapdoors, this one is a trapdoor, opens up just like that, okay, were used up until 1894. From the end of the Civil War up until 1894, when they came out with the first bolt-action rifle that the Army used. But this is what the 7th Cavalry carried when they came here in 1874. This is also what they carried at Little Bighorn. It was just like this. The infantry troops that came through the Black Hills with the Custer expedition There were infantry with them. It wasn't all just the 7th Cavalry. Carried these. 8-pound rifle. Imagine marching from Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck, North Dakota, down here to the Black Hills, all through the Black Hills, and then back, carrying an 8-pound rifle every day. Because there was no place to store it. I mentioned the meat can. Well, they got rid of the meat can, and they went to something a mess kit, yeah. Looks very similar, if you've been in the military, to what was issued. This one isn't from the time period, it's from World War I, because I couldn't find one, but there were just very minor changes. 1876 is when they decided to go away from the meat can and give the soldier this. And then you'd have a set of silverware that would go in there, and you had everything that you needed to eat with.
And could you cook in that?
You could, but generally there was somebody that did the cooking,
Oh,
and you
okay.
just did that. But the only thing you could cook for yourself would be maybe coffee.
So they would eat out of that.
Yes, this is what you would eat out of.
Is that aluminum?
Yeah, this is aluminum. This is what you get your coffee in. You'd have a tin cup like this that you would carry. It would be in your personal bag. You would carry those. And of course, you had to have a canteen for your water. Okay? This is an infantry canteen. Cavalry canteens, the straps were a little shorter and had a hook, so they could hook them on their saddle. So if you were a cavalry soldier and you ended up separated from your horse, well, there went your blanket, your canteen, your extra ammunition, everything that an infantry soldier carried. So even though the infantry soldier had to carry a lot and march a lot, he had everything on his back. The cavalry soldier, everything was on his horse, except for his rifle and his pistol and 40 rounds of ammunition.
So did someone, higher up, keep the ammunition for all of them?
Yes, yeah, they were issued, when they went out into the field, they were issued 40 rounds of ammunition to carry on their person and another 40 to 60 rounds in their baggage, in their backpack if they were infantry, in their saddlebags if they were cavalry, depending on what they were expecting to go into. And there would have been an ordnance sergeant who was in charge of the ammunition, and he would issue out the ammunition. If they were doing training, which they did very little of because they felt ammunition was expensive, so they didn't do a lot of training. But the ordnance sergeant was the one that was in charge of all that. That was his responsibility, making sure they had ammunition, and then he would issue it out. Okay, here's a picture that shows that canvas belt that they wore. Okay, it's a little bigger in size than the other one that I have here. Again, infantry soldiers because of the long rifle. Let's see, did I mark down? Okay, this is the 13th Infantry, which wasn't at Fort Meade, but from 1885. Okay, the one guy's got a pistol stuck in his belt. That's probably a prop from the photographer to make it look better, because he is a private. He wouldn't have been carrying a pistol. But the photographer said, here, let's put this in there, make it look good.
One of them has a stripe on his pants.
Yep, and he's got stripes on his shoulders. He's a non-commissioned officer. He's actually a corporal, and he would have stripes. The corporals would have narrow stripes, and sergeant stripes would be wider. Okay, here we have some of the 7th Cavalry out at Fort Meade, on parade with their sabers drawn in their dress uniforms. You can tell that by the dress helmet, very distinct. And you can tell it's Fort Meade by looking at the background. You can see the gap coming into town. So, and that's what they used the parade ground for, out at Fort Meade for that. They trained so that they could maneuver their horses. If you were ever in the military and know about marching and drill, they did the same thing on horses. They would do formations on horseback, the cavalry.
Lee, that was one of the other things they used that parade ground was for polo.
Yeah,
And they liked the recruits to play polo so they learn how to ride and handle their horses.
here's a picture of the later backpack. I showed the picture of the soldiers of the 25th Infantry when they went away from all the different parts to it. This is the backpack they had with their blanket roll on top. So instead of having 3 or 4 bags attached to them, they would just have the one and carry everything with it. You can see his cups hanging down on the bottom there. Okay, somebody asked, how much did it weigh? This is what an infantry soldier would have carried. 60 rounds of ammunition, about 5.5 pounds. His overcoat, just over 5 pounds. The blanket, just over 5 pounds. The rubber blanket, just over 3 pounds. His rifle, 8.5 pounds. Extra clothing, 2 pounds, depending on what he had. And that would have been an extra shirt and socks. And maybe underwear. Full canteen, 5 days of rations. So if they were going out in the field, they were given 5 days of rations. So for a total weight of almost 42 pounds that the infantry soldier would carry. Compare that to today, what today's modern military carries with their full gear, which is, from my understanding, about twice that. When they have everything that they carry. But their rifle doesn't weigh 8.5 pounds either. So now we got some pictures that just show different soldiers attired a little bit differently. This is from Fort Meade, another picture of the 8th Cavalry. I don't know where the picture was taken. It's one of those that I would love to find where it was at, but considering the size of Fort Meade.
I always thought it was in that S-curve area somewhere before
Yeah.
they really widened it and
Yeah.
dug it out and everything.
Well,
Yeah.
and some of them show that rim rock. on
Right,
the
yep, you can see that in the
but this
background of
one-
a few of them.
Yeah,
So,
Be on Weber Hill.
yeah, it's hard to say where it's at. But it's all, they're infantry, and they were target shooting. You can see just some of the things that I've mentioned as far as the clothing that they had, equipment that they had. The officers, there's one sitting down. Imagine that. The officers sitting down, taking it easy, as the rest of them are posing for the picture. Okay? Here is a sergeant from the 25th Infantry, just in his fatigue uniform. You can see how wide the stripe is down his trousers. Okay, posing with probably his daughter would be my assumption, but I can't say for sure. It's not identified as to who it is or anything. Okay, this is an interesting troop. This was Troop L of the 3rd Cavalry that was out at Fort Meade. Troop L was all Native Americans. It was an experiment that the Army tried. They had a few troops of cavalry that they made up of local Native Americans to see how it would work. Well, this troop only was in existence for about 4 years because the soldiers either died due to disease or deserted or were discharged for one reason or another. So the experiment didn't last very long for the Army, but you can see how they're dressed. And notice the one guy in the front row. He doesn't have a cap on. He's got a hat.
yeah.
And then, I'm sure you all recognize this gentleman, a well-known character in Fort Meade history. Also was at the Little Bighorn, that's Major Reno. In his dress uniform, you can see an officer's dress uniform is a little bit fancier than an enlisted. And the higher rank that you had, the fancier they got. He's got his shoulder boards here, has a 7 in it. That's his regiment of the 7th Cavalry. Okay, and you can see his dress hat, his little dress helmet. Okay, here's Colonel Sturgis. But if you know anything about military insignia, if you look at his shoulder, a colonel like he would should have an eagle on his shoulder. He has stars
Major General.
because he had achieved the rank of Major General during the Civil War. And as such, he was allowed to wear that rank even after the war, though his permanent rank was colonel. George Custer was the same way. He had achieved the rank of general during the Civil War, but after the war, he ended up at the permanent rank of lieutenant colonel. However, he could still use and be recognized as a general, even though an actual general would outrank him. Colonel Sturgis outranked Lieutenant Colonel Custer, as they were both in the 7th Cavalry. But you can see a little bit different between his buttons are broken up into segments. It's a general officer. If I go back to Reno, his are all in a row. And then the one picture that I always include whenever I'm doing a presentation that involves Fort Meade is this gentleman here. Okay, it's a brigadier general. I have no idea who he is. I have done research trying to identify him. And I've looked at pictures of brigadier generals from the time period, and either I can find no picture of them or a picture from the Civil War 30 years earlier. Well, if you think of yourself as a picture of you from 30 years ago, or from when you were 30 versus 60, okay, it doesn't turn. And then there's some that I found, you know, okay, that's a nice picture, big beard. Okay, I can't tell if that's anywhere close to. So I've never been able to identify him yet. I still keep trying, but I always put him up anytime I do a presentation about Fort Meade. See if anybody happens to know who he is.
Well, Uncle John was.
Were there any particular regulations regarding facial hair, or was it just all personal preference?
It was personal preference.
Okay, I didn't know if there was a difference between enlisted and officers.
Nope.
Or nope.
Nope. No, they didn't have the regulations like modern military does. You know, and it would depend too on the post commander, what he approved of. Because the post commander in those days, at that post, he was the authority. If he wanted his soldiers, if he wanted them to show up for parade every day with very highly polished shoes, they would show up every day with very highly polished shoes, or they would get punished for it. If he would decide that, okay, even though it's raining today, we are going to do drill parade, dress drill parade, they would have to do it. So, you know, and the soldiers, who were they going to complain to? Everything had to go up the chain of command. So if it was an enlisted man, he talked to his sergeant, the sergeant talked to the captain went to the major or the lieutenant colonel, and they went to the colonel, who would have been the one commanding the post. And then it would have went from him to the next higher ranking general. Well, you gotta go through the post commander to get anything done, any changes made.
Was this that for me? This picture?
I think so. Well, it's in the Fort Meade collection. So, but I'm not even sure if it is or not.
What kind of pay did they all get?
It varied on your rank, and enlisted men got between $13 and $15 a month, and then it went up. And if you were an officer, your pay started at about $85 to $90 for a new lieutenant and went up from there. However, officers did have to pay for their own food. Enlisted men didn't. They were issued food. But the higher rank you were and the longer you were in service, you got paid more. And then speaking of rank, the officers, it was kind of unusual. I mentioned it was roughly 30,000 soldiers, officers and enlisted. There were officers that got promoted to captain when they'd been in for 5 years. They retired 20 years later as a captain. Not because they did anything wrong to stay as a captain, but because there weren't enough officers above them that retired or got out of the service to fill in. Because you got promoted when there was an opening above you. So if a colonel retired, the highest, the lieutenant colonel with the most seniority, who'd been in the service the longest, got promoted to colonel. And so then all the lieutenant colonels moved up one spot, even though they were lieutenant colonels. And the highest ranking major, the one that had been in the service the longest, then got promoted to lieutenant colonel. And the same thing with all the majors. And so if you were the captain, even if you were down towards the bottom of the list, you had to wait for all those captains above you to get promoted to a major. Well, he had to wait till all the majors got promoted, so you could end up your entire career being nothing more than a captain. But you didn't get pay based on years of service.
Just as a matter of comparison, a private in the Army in Civil War drew $13 a month. A private in 1973, when I entered the service, was drawing $95. Yeah, they were rolling.
Oh, well, you mentioned Colonel Sturgis, he achieved general during the Civil War?
Yes.
And then didn't he revert back to a colonel so that he could take command out at Fort Meade?
What it was during the war, during the Civil War, you had the regular army and you had volunteers, and officers would have the regular army commission, but then they would take a higher commanding position in a volunteer regiment and receive a higher rank in the volunteer regiment. And then when the war was over, if they stayed in the army, they reverted back to whatever their rank would have been. And that's what happened with Sturgis.
His rank and Custer's, for that matter, were both brevet generals.
Yeah.
They were like a field.
Yeah,
Field,
yeah, and it was because they were in command of volunteers.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but Sturgis actually ended up retiring as a general, because what they would do with those senior lieutenant colonels and colonels that had many years of service in, and there was no chance they would reach the rank of brigadier general, the day before they retired, they were promoted to that, so that their retirement pay was based on the higher rank than what they had been for all those years. So there were a number of officers, if you look at the records, that they retired this day and the day before they're promoted to a higher rank, the next higher rank, so that they can get the pension. It was kind of the way the military said, thank you for all the years you put in.
Okay, I'm looking at the background.
Yes.
There's a church, I assume,
Yeah.
and at first I thought maybe the Methodist, and then I'm thinking Presbyterian, and that background, Sturgis, I mean, the hill that we have Sturgis on, because that doesn't look like the parade ground at all.
No, it doesn't.
So, kind of in town, looking to the north,
South.
up Nellie Street or something, which wasn't
Well,
there.
that could be a dead man.
That's good.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah, but I've even looked at what I've been able to find for brigadier general officers that were coming and visiting Fort Meade
yeah,
at the time frame, and I've not been able to make any connection yet as to who he is.
Did you mention the time frame that this was taken?
This is about 1890.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking it was later.
Yeah, it's about
What was like
1890
the
because of the uniform that he's wearing.
well,
Yeah.
our church would
Yeah.
have been there, but the
Yeah.
Presbyterians wouldn't have.
Yeah, and who knows, it might not even be from this area.
Well,
But-
true.
But I'm looking at pictures, I've compared pictures of brigadier generals, And you can find lists of brigadier generals who were brigadier generals at that time. And I can't find any picture that matches. So it's still my mystery man.
And for that time, I hate to say this, he looks kind of rotund.
Yeah.
You know, I mean.
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe
so.
it's the belt going this way, but.
Well, it's entirely possible he was a general who had some sort of a major position in the military, spent most of his time in an office and not in the field.
Yeah.
So he would have been here on an inspection type tour.
Horse doesn't look particularly pleased.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. The poor horse looks.
So
So what kind of hat is that he's wearing?
that would have been the 1890 style of hat that they went to for a general officer. As I mentioned, there were changes that happened in 1892 that I wasn't going to bring up, but I always throw this picture in. But as a general officer, he would have had different things that I would have shown. And being at the 1890s, there were changes. What the enlisted men wore were different as well. But I didn't, my presentation doesn't go.
You
to
didn't
that point.
bring the cutesy little thing from the museum that you put around the buttons. So-
Oh, no, to polish them? No.
Yeah, so they could polish them without getting it on the fabric.
Right, yeah, no. I
That,
didn't.
I mean, that's an interesting, to me, to women, a little gizmo
Yeah.
that went around all of
Yeah,
the.
it was a brass piece that was
Yeah.
hinged on one end and had little slots that would go over the buttons so that you could polish the brass buttons without getting the polish on your coat.
Like
That's why
that, yeah.
this coat here, the soldiers hated, because you have all those buttons.
Yeah,
You have to polish. And so it would cover
yeah,
3 or 4 buttons at a time.
yeah. Or let the buttons pop out
Mhm.
and cover the
Yeah,
fabric.
yeah, the fabric would be covered.
Those look as shiny as the one we found.
Yeah.
Amazing, yeah.
Well, any other questions? Because I have reached the end of my presentation. Go back to this. Well, thank you all for
Thank you.
your attention.